Order, order. I call on Lloyd Russell Moyle to move the motion.
I beg to move that this House has considered the treatment of Kurds in Turkey. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for inviting me to speak on this. As the Vice Chair of the APPG for Kurds in Turkey, I wanted to bring this debate forward to highlight what I believe to be a worsening situation for Kurds in Turkey. On the 31st of February, I, along with my honourable friends, the member for Enfield Southgate, Edmonton and Horsey and Wood Green, were meant to travel to Turkey to meet Leyla Guven and observe the local elections taking place in Turkey. Unfortunately, the government announced extra days of sitting due to Brexit. I suspect something that not even the government could have helped at that particular time, and we had to cancel the trip. But my honourable friend from Enfield Southgate and I did travel down to Newport to meet with Imam Sis. Imam is a brave Kurdish activist from Newport who, 114 days ago, embarked on an indefinite hunger strike. 2 weeks ago, when we met him, the hunger strike was taking its toll on him. But although his body was giving way, his determination for the cause of Kurdish freedom was not. I will do.
As my honourable friend has alluded to, I visited Imam Sis in Newport with him, and what struck me most was Imam's plea for the world not to look on silence at the human rights abuses against the Kurds in Turkey. Deciding to go on an indefinite hunger strike for one's political cause is one of the hardest decisions and most drastic peaceful political actions that one can make. So would he agree with me that this Parliament and this government must not stay silent about human rights abuses against Kurds while British citizens are risking their lives for the Kurdish political cause?
I totally agree. We must speak up, and I hope that we will get some good responses from the front bench later on. I will do. Yeah.
Giving way. Just for the record, and first of all, congratulate the honourable gentleman on bringing it forward, and it's good to see it being debated and discussed in this chamber. I support the Kurds and their right to self-determination and for the right to be a nation and form their own government. Yeah. Alongside that, we have Turkey, an abuser of human rights, a suppressor of civil rights. Religious and ethnic groups are having their beliefs restricted. The new churches are being prevented from being built. Is it not time that the free world, the West, the Minister, this government, ourselves, stood alongside the Kurds, backed their wish for democracy and freedom, and indeed for liberty itself?
Hear, hear.
Thank you. I totally agree. And it is, of course, the case that Britain historically has been part of drawing these lines on maps that exterminated a Kurdish nation, and we therefore have responsibility to make sure that we are adding our voice for correcting an historical wrong in terms of on the map, but also recognising the role that the Kurds have played in allying with us in numerous battles, particularly the latest one against ISIS.
I was on from that point. I also congratulate him for securing this debate, and to also echo the comment that he just made. It is fact that the West, as it were, and the wider world has let down the Kurdish peoples, particularly after the First World War, and yet again when we've seen them help the rest of the world, when most recently in Syria against ISIS, again we're at danger of once again turning our backs on them, and it must not happen.
Yeah.
I totally agree. And I should, of course, mention here that my honourable friend, the member for Newport East, is the local member for Imam Sis, and she's been an advocate for his struggle, but can't be here today because of the death of her agent last week, and she's at his funeral. So she is following this with great interest. Mr. Chairman, I asked Imam, when I was with him, to write down the key demands that he wanted to be raised in Parliament. So today here I am partly putting Imam's voice on Hansard, and so we get a response. He wrote to me saying, "The hunger strikers are demanding that Turkey ends the isolation of Abdullah Öcalan, namely We are demanding that Öcalan be returned access to his lawyers and families. In not doing so, Turkey is breaking international law and its own laws. The hunger strikers are also asking for the Council of Europe's Committee for the Prevention of Torture to reopen its investigation into the conditions on Imrali Island where Öcalan is being held. I will do, the Honourable Lady.
I'm very grateful, and I too congratulate him for securing this debate. And I'm sure he will agree with me that what we have noticed as a pattern with Turkey is that there is international attention, that something that Abdullah Öcalan gets to meet, say, his lawyer briefly or his brother briefly, then the attention of the world retreats and nothing further happens, that it is essential for us to keep the pressure on and that we would call on the government to ensure that it's not just a superficial, tokenistic response on the part of the Turkish government.
I totally agree. And since 2015, very few, if any, access was granted to Abdullah Öcalan, and it is only because of some of the hunger strikes and some of the campaigning that brief interventions have been allowed for relatives to make sure that he is still alive. He was allowed no access to the external world, and his lawyer has had no access in that time.
I'm very grateful for my honourable friend for giving way. Would he, like me, praise the trade union movement in the UK for highlighting this issue as part of the Freedom for Öcalan campaign? And is he, like me, concerned that there are 700 appeals being lodged on behalf of Mr Öcalan, and he has said that lawyers aren't getting access to it?
I totally agree, and of course this last year just gone, the Durham miners' strike was themed with its international theme for freedom for Öcalan, and I think it shows, just like with many other struggles that we've had in the past, where the trade union movement is stepping up to fight for what is just and right. But, Mr Chairman, for the benefit of those watching proceedings who may not be aware of Abdullah Öcalan, he is the Kurdish leader and political philosopher who is currently imprisoned in Turkey. Last Thursday was his 70th birthday, but for 20 years of his life he has been held in prison by the Turkish authorities. Öcalan was abducted from Nairobi, Kenya, where he was in exile and this happened on February 1999, and it was an international clandestine operation involving intelligence agencies of Turkey. He was transported to the island prison where he has been kept in harsh solitary confinement. He has been forbidden to contact his lawyer since 2011, and I met his lawyer a month ago, and he has only been granted access to anyone twice since 2015. The conditions in which he is held violate not only Turkish law, but the European Convention on Human Rights, which Turkey is obliged to follow as a member of the Council of Europe. In order to protest these unlawful conditions, the then imprisoned MP for the HDP, the People's Democratic Party, Leyla Güven, began an indefinite hunger strike on the 7th of November. Leyla was imprisoned by the Turkish authorities following her critical remark on the government's bombing of Afrin in northern Syria, which, quite rightly, she described with detest. She was a sitting MP, thrown in prison for doing her job, holding the government to account. She was released 80 days later, but now, after almost 140 days, is nearing death, suffering from nausea, fever, severe headaches, insomnia and unstable blood pressure. And we have seen a set of elections in Turkey which I think are beyond anyone being able to call them fair and free, particularly in some of the Kurdish regions. Leyla in Turkey and Imam here in the UK are not alone in their hunger strike. Since the end of last year, they have been joined by 8,000 political prisoners from across Turkey, and numerous activists in Europe, North America and the Middle East have all joined Ms Güven in declaring indefinite hunger strike. Many hunger strikers are now suffering from serious health problems, but refuse medical treatment until the isolation of Öcalan is lifted. Mr Chairman, we are joined in the public gallery by 3 hunger strikers based here in London. They are, and excuse me for my pronunciation, I will probably get it wrong, Ali Poyraz, Nahida Zengin, Mehmet Said Yelmaz, who are on their 26th day, I think, 27th day of hunger strike. It is an awful position to find yourself in, feeling that it is your only recourse to political voice. but I welcome them to Parliament today, and I know that they will have many MPs in this place that, whilst not be joining them on their methods, will be sympathetic and supporting their demands. Mr. Chairman, the human rights situation in Turkey is progressively deteriorating since the breakdown of talks in the peaceful resolution for a decades-long conflict between the Kurds and Turkish state in 2015, at which point the Turkish state began engaging in a policy of brutal repression against the Kurdish population, imposing harsh 24-hour curfews along the southeastern Kurdish region and committing countless human rights abuses. And all this after Öcalan had spurned violence for peaceful political resolution. And converting, we know in Britain, converting a violence to peaceful protest is not an easy road. It requires good faith and perseverance on all sides. But the fact is, Turkey's continued repression of Öcalan's and the Kurds destroys any potential for a peaceful resolution for the Kurds and Turkey as a whole. The situation was greatly exacerbated by the state of emergency, which of course followed the failed coup in 2016, under which political opposition and trade union activity has been largely banned, alongside the removal of office of democratically elected politicians and members of parliament, and members of the judiciary, on the grounds of suspected affiliation with opposition activity, and always replacing them with President Erdogan's AKP puppets. The Council of Europe's Committee on the Prevention of Torture has visited the notorious island where Öcalan is held, Imrali, and other political prisoners, 7 times since 1999. Very few of the improvements they have called for have ever been implemented. The CPT's last visit to the island was 2016, and Turkey only gave permission for the publication of its report in 2018, 2 years later. The hunger strikers are demanding that the CPT be allowed to revisit Imrali Island prison immediately and investigate the conditions of the prisoners there to see if any of the improvements have been made. Mr. Chairman, I have been disappointed by the reaction of the growing concern. In January 2019, the Council of Europe passed the resolution, a resolution expressing concern regarding the human rights situations in Turkey and the condition of the hunger strikers, as well as calling Turkey to authorise the immediate publication of the CPT's reports. However, the resolution has been insignificant to pressure Turkey to change its ways. The hunger strikers are calling for all possible pressure to be put on Turkey to end the isolation of Öcalan before the situation escalates and there are mass casualties. So, Mr. Chairman, can I ask the Minister today what recent discussions has he had, or has the Foreign Office had, because I am aware that he's not the Minister for the Middle East and he's covering, what discussions he or his department has had with counterparts in Turkey on the treatment of Kurdish prisoners in Turkey, and in particular on the conditions in Imrali Island. Will he seek assurances from the Turkish authorities that Öcalan is granted access to his lawyer in compliance with Turkish law and international law? Will he, as a matter of urgency, seek to have the Council of Europe's Committee for the Prevention of Torture reopen their investigation into Imrali Island? And will the government support the Welsh Assembly's referral to the CPT on this matter so that it has the backing of the whole of the British state? Will we ensure that our member of the CPT is raising this issue in those committee meetings? Turkey is a NATO ally, but we must not allow a friendship to stop us from demanding fair and just treatment of all citizens. We have seen in Northern Ireland and other parts of the world that we only achieve lasting peace if political leaders on all sides are given legitimacy, respect and a seat at the table to forge peace. The British government must stand with the Kurdish peoples. As I've mentioned already, we have an historic duty as well as a current humanitarian moral duty to do so, so that we seek and they seek peace that they desperately deserve. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Minister Mark Field. Oh, the question is considered the treatment of Kurds in Turkey. Mark Field, Minister.
Didn't want to get in the way of your few words there, Mr. Houth. May I say how grateful I am to the Honourable Member for Brighton Kemp Town for securing this debate and for the contributions made by the other honourable members. My right honourable friend, the Minister for Europe and the Americas, can't be here today and sends his apologies, so the fact that I'm speaking on Turkey isn't even more of an extension of my duties, but it is a great pleasure to respond on behalf of the government. And I shall try to respond, if I may, to all of the points that have been raised, and I hope the honourable gentleman will forgive me if I fail so to do. We will do so in writing afterwards. Obviously, we are aware of the issues around the hunger strike, and I'll go into some more detail because I know it's been raised, obviously, by a number of honourable members earlier on for Imam Sis, in protest at the conditions in which Abdul Öcalan is being held. On the issue of election outcomes that were also raised by the honourable gentleman, we note the preliminary conclusions of the Congress of Local and Regional Authorities of the Council of Europe who monitored Turkey's local elections. This includes wins for the HDP in a number of major cities in the southeast. Their conclusions welcomed the impressive turnout of 84%, calling it, on the one hand, a sign of healthy democratic interest and awareness. But we also do note the deep concerns that were raised about the fairness of the campaigning environment, particularly in relation to the media coverage, and we shall encourage the Turkish authorities to engage with the recommendations of the full report, which are due in July. More specifically in Istanbul, as the honourable gentleman will be aware, recounts are ongoing, and the governing AKP party has appealed to the Supreme Election Court for a full recount. We must, of course, await the decision of the Supreme Election Council, which may adjudicate on this issue as soon as the 13th of April. Meanwhile, the CHP candidate for Ankara received his certificate of election on Monday by Turkey's Supreme Election Council. May I say a little bit about broader relations with Turkey? I don't think it was fair that the honourable gentleman, in his own contribution, recognised that Turkey is a vital partner for the UK. It's a long-term member of NATO. It sits on NATO's southern border at the very front line of some of the most difficult challenges that we face. We work together, obviously, to counter terrorism, to build our prosperity and to pursue stability in our neighbourhood, and recognising that a lot of these issues now, of course, are of global importance. We should also, I think, acknowledge that Turkey is hosting some 3.6 million Syrian refugees at a considerable cost. Of the approximately 83 million Turkish citizens, some 15 to 18 million are of Kurdish origin. They live in all parts of Turkey, from the traditional Kurdish heartlands of the southeast to the larger cities in the west. There are perhaps 3 million, of course, in Istanbul alone. They are mainly in the Turkish diaspora, including, of course, here in the UK, who contribute very positively, not just to the UK economy, but, in fact, culturally. And I know that the honourable gentleman for Enfield Southgate, no longer here, recognises the particular importance of the Turkish diaspora in that part of North London. So I think the important thing is we can't entirely generalise when we talk about the Kurds or indeed their plight. They are a diverse section of society with a range of political affiliations, lifestyles and outlooks. There are also large Kurdish populations, as all members will be aware, in Iraq, in Iran and in Syria, all countries, of course, of great strategic importance to the UK. Our approach to the issue of the Kurds in Turkey needs, of course, to reflect aspects of that wider context. Nor, of course, should we generalise when we talk about the treatment of Kurdish people in Turkey. Now, I absolutely note the concerns that have been expressed in this debate about the policies of the current Turkish government towards Kurds, and I shall try, if I may, to address some of the issues that have been raised. It is, of course, worth remembering that a great many people of Kurdish origin voted and continue to vote for the AKP government, and indeed have served in it. Two of Turkey's most recent deputy prime ministers were indeed of Kurdish origin. I think all Turks, regardless of their ethnicity or faith, enjoy the same rights under the Turkish constitution. And from 2003 onwards, and especially following the 2009 Kurdish opening policy, the AKP did much to end the historic restrictions on the free expression of Kurdish identity in Turkey. Now, the Turkish government have always said that their quarrel is not with the Kurds as a whole, but with the specific terrorist groups that threaten the Turkish state. Now, I appreciate this is obviously an issue that is open to some dispute, both within Turkey and, of course, for those who have an interest in the Turkish issue here in the UK. But the Turkish state has been locked in a bitter conflict with the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, since the 1980s. The PKK is a proscribed terrorist organisation in the UK and, indeed, throughout much of the world. No, of course.
does he recognise that the latest court ruling in Belgium about the PKK's prescribed status in European law does open up a discussion, at least, about whether the PKK are still an active terrorist group or they have moved and transitioned to more peaceful means?
I do understand that, and I also think it is worth pointing out, and I see it from my own brief, obviously, my normal day-to-day brief in Asia and Pacific, as well as in the Middle East and North Africa, that the issue about proscription of organisations is always quite fluid. It's constantly under review. But the tragic conflict that has resulted in an estimated 40,000 deaths and the displacement of millions of people in south-eastern Turkey, an end to that conflict is possible. Between 2013 and 2015, the Turkish government and the PKK engaged in really quite fruitful negotiations to end it, and a ceasefire was for much of that time in place. Sadly, that ceasefire broke down in July of 2015, and since then, according to the International Red Cross, the International Crisis Group, more than 4,000 people have been killed. These include more than 400 civilians and over 1,000 members of the Turkish security forces. The UK, I know, and for those members who have a strong interest in this matter, not least because of the diaspora who are often based in their constituencies, very much hope that these negotiations can reopen in order to bring to an end this conflict and to prevent further deaths. For that to happen, the PKK must end its campaign of terror, and of course we very much urge them so to do. Honourable members across the board, and I note here, still in the House, we have two from Plaid Cymru, for the honourable members for Dwin for Merioneth and Ceredigion. I'm sure I pronounced those wrong. Actually, there are no English members here at all. We've got from Northern Ireland, we have the honourable gentleman from Strangford, and of course the honourable gentleman for the Scottish Nationalists from South West Glasgow as well. But I know that all have raised the serious situation of the imprisoned PKK leader, Abdul Öcalan. We naturally condemn PKK's acts of violence, just as we condemn all forms of terrorism. However, we also naturally expect Turkey properly to respect its international obligations regarding the treatment of all of its prisoners. We are aware that the Council of Europe's Committee for the Prevention of Torture reported on Mr. Öcalan's prison conditions as recently as March 2018, and British embassy officials discussed his case and the case of hunger-striking prisoners with Turkish officials in January. Honourable members have raised the issue of hunger strikes by prisoners, including the members of the People's Democratic Party, the HDP. Whilst it is, of course, distressing to witness any hunger strike, and obviously we see that if it is closer to home in Newport or elsewhere, the decision to embark on one is, of course, a matter for the individual concerned. And as I said, we expect Turkey to respect the international obligations with regard to prison conditions, including ensuring access to appropriate medical treatment. A number of HDP MPs have been arrested on the basis of their alleged links with the PKK. Now, if these links are proved to be accurate, we urge the HDP to distance itself entirely from the PKK and any terrorist activity. However, I have to say to the House that we have registered our concern with the Turkish authorities at the very large number of relatively recent detentions, including the HDP leader, Selahattin Demirtaş. Our embassy in Ankara, alongside other diplomatic missions, has attempted to observe Mr. Demirtaş's trial hearings. We have, unfortunately, I have to say to the House, sometimes been prevented from so doing. We urge the Turkish authorities to allow diplomatic missions to observe such trials so that we can understand the evidence on which the charges are based. Honourable members raised concerns about the replacement of large numbers of HDP mayors in the southeast of Turkey with state-appointed trustees, and President Erdogan has suggested that the same measures may be taken following the local elections last month. The decision, of course, was taken on the basis that these mayors and their municipalities were allegedly channeling funding and political support to the PKK. Again, if that is the case, we should condemn it unreservedly. However, we also expect the Turkish state to undertake any legal processes against locally elected representatives fairly, transparently, and with the full respect of international law and rule of law. This, of course, is vital to the long-term health, not just of Turkish democracy, but also, increasingly importantly, for Turkey's international reputation. As members will know, in 2016 there was an attempt made to overthrow the government of Turkey by force. Obviously, we are thankful that attempt failed, but many innocent civilians were killed. I'm proud the UK government stood alongside our Turkish allies on that night, and the Minister for Europe at the time travelled to Turkey as soon as he could show solidarity. I also accept that the trauma, and I accept that aspects of that trauma also have allowed more space for other activity. But that trauma of that coup attempt is still fresh in the Turkish consciousness. Turkish, if you'll excuse me, because I think I am running slightly out of time. No, go on.
It's a very quick question. Could he just respond to me personally? Does he feel personally comfortable that the PKK is aligned with terrorist groups such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda on the prescribed list?
The issue about a prescribed list, as the Honourable Lady, the Right Honourable Lady will be aware, is that obviously we have a prescription in place for good reason. It isn't as a hit list of acceptability from one to another. I accept that until such time as the PKK denounces violence, then it must recognise that it will be regarded as prescribed in certain parts of the world, and indeed in many parts of the world. And I would like to see those people who have been active there and therefore who would wish to, in denouncing violence, obviously to ensure that they are no longer prescribed and to play a proper and full part in the democratic process. But that there isn't really a sort of an acceptable list from A to Z, as it were, of within that prescribed list. You either are prescribed or you're not. Yes, I think one might objectively sit back and think there are certain organisations who are more dangerous to our interests than others, but nonetheless there are rules for prescription which I think are right. They should be in place. I do believe that the Turkish government has a right, indeed a responsibility, to act against the perpetrators of any coup attempt and against all who have committed or are planning terrorist acts. However, it is also of vital importance that any and all measures taken are proportionate and in line with Turkey's democratic principles and, of course, its freely given human rights obligations. We shall continue to express our concern to Turkey where we believe that is not the case. This, of course, has included a number of individual cases, including that of the former Amnesty Director, Taner Kilic, who was released on bail last year. We look forward to the judicial reforms that Turkey's Reform Action Group are considering and hope this will make a genuine difference to other cases of concern, including those of civil society patron Osman Kavala. We remain concerned at the prospect of the response, including the number of the sheer scale of the response, I should say, including the number of civil servants who've been dismissed summarily from their jobs, and especially the number of journalists who have been detained. We believe a free press is an essential component of a healthy democracy. Indeed, it's something that the UK is championing. I know will have support across the House with our own Defend the Media Freedom campaign in 2019, which will culminate in a conference here in London on the 10th and 11th of July, along with our friends from Canada. In raising these issues, we will never ever forget the trauma, of course, of that coup attempt and the extraordinary security threats that Turkey has faced and continues to face on a day-to-day basis. And we can see that obviously just by a look at the map of the region. Mr. Houth, if I may just conclude by saying this to the honourable gentleman, we shall continue to engage with Turkey and with other countries that have significant and sizable Kurdish populations on all of the issues that have been raised very specifically in this important debate today. And we shall continue to press for lasting solutions that are proportionate, democratic and lawful.
The question is, this House has considered the treatment of Kurds in Turkey. Is many of that opinion say aye? With some enthusiasm? Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. The sit-in is suspended until 2:30 p.m.